American Association of Chemistry Teachers, AACT, for a live chat with distinguished chemist and Nobel Laureate Roald Hoffmann. I'm Carmen Drahl, a senior editor for Chemical and Engineering News magazine, and I'll be hosting this evening's chat. To start off with a little bit of background about Dr. Hoffmann, he was born in Poland and came to the United States when he was 12. He studied chemistry at Columbia and Harvard and has been at Cornell since 1965. He is the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters Emeritus. In 1981, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his theories concerning the course of chemical reactions. A true Renaissance man, Dr. Hoffmann is also an accomplished poet and playwright. And he's here to take your questions this evening about chemistry, education, and other topics that pique your interest. If you'd like to participate in the conversation this evening, simply type your questions into the panel or use Twitter with AACT Connect and the hashtag NobelChat, and I will incorporate them into our discussion as best I can. Welcome, Dr. Hoffmann. How are you this evening?
I'm fine. I'm so glad to be with teachers. Teachers have been very important in my life, and I'm also a teacher, or I have been until I retired. Anyway, I'm glad to talk to people.
Well, that's good that you're among colleagues and like-minded folks. Our first question is actually perhaps about a teacher. Please, would you tell us about the event or the person who inspired you to pursue chemistry?
Well, I'm a rather strange beast in a way because I did not decide really to be a chemist until halfway through my PhD in chemistry at Harvard. But early on, I do remember something. I played with chemistry sets for sure, but something happened when we were still refugees in Germany after World War II. And I read two books, and it's interesting what they were, that first showed me what chemistry was like. And the first of these was a biography of Marie Curie by her daughter, Eve. Many people have read that. Incidentally, I read these in German translation. And then there might be a good reason why I'd be interested in the life of a Polish-French woman scientist. It was wonderful. The second book, though, was a little bit unusual. It was a biography of George Washington Carver, the black American agricultural chemist. And that was absolutely remarkable to me, maybe because here was George Washington Carver making things out of soybeans and sweet potatoes, all kinds of chemicals and drugs. And maybe part of the interest was that I had not seen what a sweet potato or a peanut or a soybean was at that point in my life. It's rather interesting that the world opened up to me in chemistry as a result of reading these two books, one about a woman chemist and the other about a black African-American agricultural chemist, rather different from the environment around me then.
Certainly true. Well, chemists and chemistry, we think, are everywhere. I find it fascinating that books, obviously you said that you played with a chemistry set, but that books could create this world of chemistry for you and sort of spark that enthusiasm. And I mean, maybe I see a parallel in your own path, perhaps.
Yes, the books were very important, but I'm of that period. So now it'd be interesting to see if in today's web-based world, what takes the equivalent of that for young people. I certainly played with chemistry. I made little tracks with gunpowder on a piece of paper. How did I get that? I put together the gunpowder, of course, from chemicals I could buy at a local pharmacy. By this time we were in the United States, and I was 11 and a half when we came. We lived in Brooklyn and then moved up in the world to Queens. And I remember playing with chemistry, and it was lots of fun. In high school, I went to one of these science-oriented schools in New York City, Stuyvesant High School, a great school. The only advanced placement course I did not take was in chemistry. Then I took again chemistry in college at Columbia, but the instruction until my senior year was, let us say, not inspiring. So what kept me going in chemistry? I got into it in college because there was a lot of family pressure, typical for the Jewish European immigrants of that time, and exactly paralleled by what I see the pressures on the Asian American immigrants that are populating Stuyvesant High School and our colleges too, and that is the pressure to gain a profession. There was a lot of pressure from my parents to become a doctor. I really didn't want to become a doctor, but on the way I started taking usual pre-med courses. But then finally, about halfway through college, I worked up the courage to tell my parents I didn't want to become a real doctor. And then chemistry was sort of the next thing that I could do. But what kept me going all the time was wonderful summer research experiences, not at the university, but in my case at national laboratories. These are sort of like today they're called REU, Research for Undergraduates. And in my case it was at the National Bureau of Standards, which at that time was in Washington on Connecticut Avenue. Now it's outside in Gaithersburg. And I was there 2 years, and then another 2 years at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And in those experiences, I got a feeling for what research was like. And that's the only thing that kept me going in chemistry.
Well, it's a good thing that those experiences were there for you. We know that not everyone is fortunate enough to have those kinds of experiences, but tell me, what advice would you have for teachers trying to create inspiring research opportunities or experiences with limited resources?
Well, it's hard to create that research experience at a school level. As I said, I was fortunate enough to go to a science-oriented high school. And today there is even a pressure to remove from the laboratory chemicals or the doing of reactions in volume. And that's too bad. I wish we could find something that's computer-based, that has some of the feeling of a modern chemistry course. It need not be a game. It could be something where something like a game where you mix some chemicals and then there is a simulation of what happens. And yes, most of the time you would get brown gunk, the most common product of organic reactions. If you've done them, you know what I mean. But another time you would get an explosion. But still, that would be something interesting. And the prizes, the payoff would be for making something which could have some potential, let's say, as a pharmaceutical. And then I could see such a game leading into actually the business side of trying to test the pharmaceutical and to bring it to FDA approval. So it's a long
Sims for pharma.
Sort of, yes, Sims or a mind spring of. I would love to see someone put in some effort into making something like that. On one level, a game. On another level, something more serious.
Maybe that's, well, what you're saying reminds me of the iPad app that the Chemical Heritage Foundation came up with last fall now. Last spring rather, and they don't have the business end of it, but they certainly have it's a virtual chemistry set. Mix, your alkali metals and water, and make things smoke and bang and whiz. I don't know. One thing I wish they did was that I wish they had incorporated a lot more of the smells. I don't think you could do that with an iPad.
No, that's a little hard to do. But it'll come soon. We'll have virtual reality so people can feel molecular models with their hands. I think that's very near. The game-playing units we have are pretty close to creating a virtual reality environment. But smells are something we have to work on still. Anyway, I'd love to talk to the teachers if there are any questions from people out in the audience.
We do indeed have questions. Here's one. As a professor of chemistry, what's your favorite topic to teach and why?
So it's a strange thing because it sounds very advanced and sophisticated, but it's not. So I happen to like to teach why I like to teach about free energy and what makes a reaction go. So what I would write down is the equation that we all know, that the change in a free energy, delta G, is a delta H minus T delta S. So that has a part that is an enthalpy change and a part which is measured by the temperature of an entropy change. And I think one can teach students to make guesses about whether a reaction that you write down is endothermic or exothermic, whether delta H is positive or negative. And you can also teach students pretty well to make guesses about what delta S will be qualitatively for a reaction, on the principle that delta S is positive if you create disorder, if you create more particles, and delta S is negative if you are ordering. And then what I like to do for the students is I like to give them the 4 possible outcomes of this. We know that delta G, the free energy change, should be negative in order for a reaction to go spontaneously, not worrying about barriers. But then there are 4 possibilities. The reaction can be exothermic or endothermic, and the reaction can be ordering or disordering. So these 4 possibilities are interesting. For instance, if the delta H is negative and delta S is positive, then because of the formula delta G is delta H minus T delta S, the reaction will always be spontaneous. But so something that goes downhill in energy and creates disorder will always go. And then, on the other hand, if something goes uphill in energy, that's endothermic, and if it creates order, then it'll never go. And then I like to, the other 2 possibilities are very interesting, where you go downhill in energy, but you create disorder. And an example of that might be when you go downhill in energy and you create order. I said it wrong. So an example is, I got to give an example. H2 plus O2 to give H2O, the proverbial hydrogen balloon exploding, right? Okay, so in that reaction is exothermic. It creates energy and it creates order. So that reaction will, whether it goes goes or not depends on the temperature. So I can teach that. I'm saying it to you in words, but it would be much better if I could draw it on a blackboard or on an overhead. But I love talking about these possibilities, about the 4 possibilities, giving an example of each, showing how the temperature affects things, and then when I get through and I get to something, when I say this reaction will not go because it's endothermic and ordering, how can I make it go if I want it to go? I can by putting in energy, by putting in electrical energy or by heat, so that I can make reactions go that don't want to go. And that ability to manipulate reactions, to me, is very interesting. And I love teaching that.
Wonderful. The next question from the audience is, how have you seen, it's sort of a two-parter, how have you seen chemical education change over the course of your career? And to what extent has this change been for the good or the bad?
Well, it's an interesting question. So things go through change. When I studied and when I first taught, and especially at Cornell, where Cienko and Plain were teachers, that was the main textbook of introductory chemistry. It was light years away from a modern textbook, which it was just 200, 300 pages. It had pretty simple black and white drawings, no photographs to speak of, and very few worked examples. So now the books run to 1,000 pages. They cost 10 times as much. And what is much worse is that the writers of those books cannot resist the pressure from the publishers to leave good enough alone, and they are forced by the economics of publishing, because the buying back of books is so quick and so efficient, they're forced to put out a new edition in every 2 years. I think the textbooks have gotten much too gimmicky, organized with, and I think some things have improved, but I think overall I prefer what we had before. I think the students have gone through, our students at the university have gone through cycles. There was a period where the hippie world and Vietnam era protests drew away a lot of students from us, and they were interested in other things. I think students are now much too professionally minded overall. It's not just medicine, but other things as well. I think clearly the education has been impacted by technology. Always behind we are, and with some problems. The problems are pretty obvious, but for me, so what are the problems? The problems are, for instance, a teacher coming into a classroom and preparing on overhead transparencies, an overhead up slideshow, but the slideshow, he or she goes much, much too fast, because that's what he can get in. And the students are not going through the manual task of writing down the notes. They now often demand that the lectures be available. That manual task with the link between what your hands do and what goes on in your brain was a rather important part of learning. So it sounds like I'm talking like a man of my age who is 77. But there are good things. I operate in that in-between world where I use what the web gives me, and I can organize a presentation on almost anything in the world in chemistry in about half an hour. I can organize 20 slides, and it's just wonderful. I draw on the images, and yes, I should give credit for the images, but the images are there. The explanations are there. We were in a group meeting, and we were discussing muonium, which is a compound of an hydrogen atom made of an anti-muon, which is a positive particle with a mass of 200. And we were discussing a scientific paper, but I could go out to Wikipedia. Yes, a wonderful thing, as unreliable as it sometimes is. And I could immediately pull up an article on what muonium is, even if I didn't know which I didn't, what muonium exactly was. And I could get that, and I can get an image of a snail that secretes in a gland something which is a precursor to the indigo molecule. And I can pull up an article that discusses that making of the indigo, the dye, by that snail. All of that in seconds. That's really made a wonderful change.
Everything has two faces, it seems. A follow-up to that coming in is, how are the challenges in education that we face in the future similar to challenges that we've overcome already?
Well, I'm not sure what that question means, but I think one of the challenges that we face in education, and that American education has been good at, is at providing alternative pathways to achievement, education, and the professions through the educational system. I'll explain in a moment what I mean. And the other thing that American education has done pretty well in the past is in terms of pulling in all kinds of people to give a fairly egalitarian education. Now, first about the alternative pathways. So I came from Europe. In Europe, in my time, and to some extent still today, there are tests that are taken at age 11 and 14, which will determine whether you go to college, essentially. And the pathways, what do we have instead? And I've seen it, actually, in a number of instances. We have cases of immigrants coming here from South America with not even a recognized high school education. And they work for a while in menial jobs or not so menial, but eventually they can go back and get a high school equivalency. And then they often go to a junior college. And this is not only the immigrants, it's also kids who have had problems in the educational system here. You go to a junior college, you can go transfer from the junior college to a four-year college, and eventually you can get into graduate school at Cornell. The baccalaureate origins of the people we have in chemistry are very diverse. They come from, sure, from some good colleges and universities, but they also come from big city universities, from branches of the state university, state colleges that you never heard of. And I think it's wonderful that there are these different ways to connect, to get up, to retrieve later on in life, when you're better motivated for whatever reason it may be, that you can come back into the educational system. The other point I mentioned was that is a real advantage of our American system, is that it tries to draw in people from very diverse backgrounds, from immigrant groups, from other, people who have been disadvantaged in various ways. We try to draw them in university. Now, I think to some extent, in part, we are dealing with things that are not out of our control. What I mean in that is, whereas the kind of immigrant that I represented, a World War II Polish-Jewish immigrant, we were bound to take advantage of the American educational system. The child of the local Korean grocer in New York City is also very likely to be headed for a good college. But the children of the Latino immigrants and of certain other groups have taken a much longer time to advance to the university and to take advantage of what the American system offers. This is in some ways a repetition of what happened 100 or more years ago. The children of the Irish and Scandinavian immigrants also took a much longer time to get into the university. But eventually they got there. And I think what we are beginning to see are sort of second or third generation Latino students, children from immigrants, coming into the university system. And I think we're very good at providing that. The price we may pay is we don't serve so well the more, perhaps, students which have a special advantage. Of course, we'll never serve those. We'll never recognize enough the talents of those children in Lake Wobegon who are all above average. But we are going to, I think we do pretty well in our educational system.
That's interesting. There were a few questions that came in that asked, to what extent you think the U.S. is behind in STEM education and things like how to get back on course. It sounds like, well, I won't put words in your mouth. What do you think about that?
Well, I think first of all, I don't think those tests that show that we're behind are so accurate. Look, those tests, I wrote a column fighting with some of those results of those tests 40 years ago in the New York Times, and oh my God, we've been behind forever. So what puts us ahead? What puts us ahead is a liberal immigration policy, and fairly egalitarian system, a free enterprise system too, an education that is accessible to many people. I think we could do better. We could pay science teachers more. We could restore some of the dignity to the teaching profession. I think overall, so what I'm saying is this is a contrarian view, I actually don't think we're so far behind. Now, some people will argue with me that saying that America keeps ahead by, in fact, importing talent, brain talent from elsewhere, from other countries at an advanced level. Well, yes, but they become Americans, and the immigrants, we are all immigrants in this world, in the new world. I think and the same people would point to saying that there are certain American groups which are not well served. For instance, African Americans or some of our Latino immigrants. They're not well served by our educational system. I don't think it's so bad. Overall, but I'm always an optimist about things, so that I tend to think that we're not doing too badly. I think we should encourage young people to enter the teaching profession, and I think we should provide incentives for teachers in terms of better pay. I'm not sure I like the system of using local tax bases to finance our educational system. But that in part is based on my being a European and originally seeing another system.
Well, I guess we'll see if the Twitterverse comes alive with criticism of your point of view. In the meantime, here's a fascinating one. As a chemistry student, what topics did you struggle with in school?
Let's see. As a chemistry student, I don't remember struggling with anything, but I'll tell you the only course in which I got a B in college, and that was a math course in set theory. Now, I knew I wasn't going to be a mathematician, but why did I take that course? It sounded interesting, and I took it. In chemistry, I had no problem with anything, not even with analytical chemistry. It looks like all my analyses went well. So it was lots of fun at Columbia. Can't remember anything that really gave me trouble. A little bit later on, in studying organic chemistry, to which I've made contributions through the introduction of molecular orbital-like thinking into it, but I had some trouble with arrow pushing, which was used as a sort of shorthand to indicate how electrons flow. I really had trouble learning that. I now understand it, and it's beautiful, but I had trouble with it. I think I also did not appreciate, though I had no trouble with it, I did not appreciate until recent times the beautiful heuristic mechanism of Lewis structures and how far that is useful in chemistry. And I wish our students would understand this. We spend a lot of time on it in introductory chemistry, and it actually gives you a good first way to think about where electrons are in any molecule in the world.
It's a good thing that you took something out of that experience, that struggle. For those folks who are just tuning in, we are live with Dr. Roald Hoffmann, Nobel Laureate at Cornell University. This is a chat from the American Association of Chemistry Teachers, and I'm Carmen Drahl at Chemical and Engineering News. The questions keep coming in. Here's one about how did you decide to get into writing, and how does writing make you a better teacher?
So as for getting into writing, it all began in college. In that same time when my chemistry courses until my last year were rather dull at Columbia. At Columbia there's a core curriculum, so everyone's required to take a sort of introduction to literature. It's called freshman humanities, and contemporary civilization to political thought, and history of art and music. And the world opened up to me in those fields. I took a poetry course with Mark Van Doren, a wonderful teacher. His poetry has faded a little bit, but he was a great teacher. I took a history of art course with Howard McFarland Davis, another great teacher at Columbia. And these just opened up the world to me, as did the humanities course. And that I followed that up with some other courses. I did not do any writing at that time, but that it was Mark Van Doren. I still remember the poem. It was Wallace Stevens' Sunday Morning, and he read it for us and asked us to comment on it. But that sort of opened up the world of poetry. I did not try to seriously write anything until I was around 40 in midlife. Now, the second part of the question, I would first of all turn it around a little bit. Actually, being a teacher has helped me to become a better writer. Let me explain that, and then I'll come back to the other way, too. What I mean by this is that, to me, the essential act of teaching, which was honed in my case by teaching introductory chemistry at many levels at Cornell, all the 43 years that I taught. I'm now retired, and I don't teach anymore. But half of my teaching time was in an introductory chemistry course. Now, before doing that teaching at various levels, at honors and at teaching it to 700 pre-meds, if you can imagine that, and teaching it to people who were in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences who weren't going to go on in chemistry or anything. What that forced me to do is it forced me to explain things without the crutch of mathematics. So let me explain. I took a thermodynamics course in graduate school. And thermodynamics has this interesting practical base of heat engines originally, and people in 18th century England worrying about why you couldn't get more efficiency out of a steam engine. Has this practical basis, and then it has this beautiful mathematical structure. And there is a tendency to fall in love with the mathematical structure and forget about the practical basis of the thermodynamics. And I knew all those relationships, a partial derivative of energy with respect to volume being related to the pressure. I knew all of those things, but until I had to teach thermodynamics without that mathematics, I didn't understand it. And that's what teaching taught me. The other thing that teaching taught me is that the most fundamental aspect of teaching, of good teaching, is that it is an empathetic act. That is, that you, as a teacher, you put yourself in the student's mind. That's where the empathy comes. And you try to see what it is that gives the student trouble. Now, you have a mix of students there. There are some students who understand everything. There are other ones who are sleeping, and third type who don't understand very much. You somehow manage to speak to all at the same time. That is the magic of the act of teaching. And it never ceases to amaze me. But what makes it work is that you care that the students understand, and you adjust what you say to what you perceive, and no, not with clickers, but from little nonverbal signs, what you perceive that the students get or don't get, and sometimes without any signs at all. You just imagine what the students know. So that trying to reach an audience, trying to understand them, that is, to me, the essence of good teaching. And somehow, when I write, I also try to reach that audience. through the writing. Now, and the teaching has actually helped me. Now, going the other way around, being a good writer, being a writer has helped me think about teaching for sure. It has helped me in that, and I think has helped me to become a teacher. It's not the act of, a good poem. The elements of a poem are, it is a very concise, economical way of saying something. Probably that is not consistent with pedagogy in the sense that when you are teaching, you often have to repeat something 2 times or 3 times, maybe in different words, to get it across to the audience. That will not work in a poem. But I did learn something about conciseness. But what I learned in a poem from poetry is that I am trying in the poem, I'm communicating with the reader. The poem must speak to someone. There is an audience in the poem. Now, I've known poets who will say, I'm just writing for this drawer. I don't care if anyone reads my poems. Well, from my experience, if you scratch them a little for that very special you, they'll read you everything they've got. To be a good poem, you have to empathize an audience. And what you need is you are not teaching facts. You are communicating something on the emotional level. So what you learn, and you don't say, I want you to feel sorrow now. That's not going to work in a poem. So you use language in ways that you communicate emotionally through the words. Now, I think I learned something from that, from writing, from learning how to do that. And when I teach, the most important act in teaching is to establish a bond with the students. Again, you can't do it with everybody, but with some, or try for most. And the bond is established on the basis that the student should somehow get the feeling that the teacher cares that the student learn. And that bond is made subtly, emotionally, in some way, through the way that the professor, the lecturer, since I'm mostly a lecturer, communicates to the student that caring. And something I learned about from writing poetry about that. Sorry for going on so long.
No, not at all. I was thinking of the analogy, a very chemical analogy of the titration, where you are giving a lecture, you're explaining a concept, and you're surveying the room, and you're sort of seeing, is everyone's eyes glazing over, or am I getting nods? And then you're sort of calibrating what you do next.
Very subtle, you have to keep alert and for those little signals from the audience. So I'm a firm believer in having a real person lecture to you rather than watching a film. Though I've also made these films with, if the high school teachers in the audience will know the world of chemistry films, we made those. It is now 27 years ago, I think, and they're still, I guess there's nothing better, but they're still being viewed by school classes around the country and around the world. It took 2 years out of my life to make those, but it was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad that that's still a rewarding memory for you. We have a question about your writing. You write often about the connections between art, philosophy, and science. Why is this important for educators and students today?
Well, first of all, it's important for me, first of all. So, and why is it important to me? Because perhaps I'm still living out my college days. I think I've gone beyond that. But that world which was created for me of science, literature, and art that I described through you through these master teachers and the subjects, that world has remained alive to me. I think more importantly, but let's leave me directly out of it, I think that this is important for the world in general. I think the world is pretty compartmentalized. We do things during the day, work or school, and then we go home and do some things with the family, and that is good. And maybe we go to church and maybe not. But the world seems to be fairly disjoint. I like to see the world as one. And as part of that, I think that, for instance, I think everyone in the world has some spiritual side to them. The spiritual to me does not mean only the religious. The spiritual side may be also something like taking care of an older parent who's infirm. It may mean redoing an old house. It may mean playing with your children. But for many people, the spiritual actions involve often the arts and literature. And I have a very broad definition of these. I run a cabaret once a month in New York City where we mix entertainment and science, and I'm open to any kind of music providing it's live, no matter what the noise level, for instance. And I'm lucky that I can do this. But I think for many of us, the spiritual side of our lives is actually, as I say it, I think it's fulfilled more by music and art than it is by religion. And I think that the listening to a song, listening to it several times, maybe singing into it. I know, for instance, of no greater thing that gives me a spiritual high than dancing with friends. Not necessarily dancing with one other person, though that may be, but just a group of people doing typical loose American dancing to, I don't know what to, since I'm of a certain generation, it's going to be Bob Marley and the Wailers. It's that kind of spiritual activity where you feel connected to other people and to something different from yourself is very important. Okay, so that's a long introduction. I think there is a spiritual side to doing chemistry, but I think part of the reasons that I think it's important not to compartmentalize our lives and to let some of those spiritual activities come into and mix in some way with the science. And that's very important to me.
So this next question perhaps connects to that then. How do you foster creativity in science education? And is it something you can teach?
Everyone wants to know the secret to creativity, as if we could.
Don't they tell it to you when you get the Nobel Prize, maybe? That'd be...
But this was a question about creativity in science education. Or
Yes,
maybe
that's
it was
true.
a question about creativity. How there are things which you can do to foster, I think, creativity. I think a company that does research in pharmaceutical chemistry or elsewhere would be well advised to have on every floor of its laboratories a little Italian bar with espresso and some biscotti served, where people could go and drink a coffee and talk to each other. I think lots of ideas would come out from that setting. So what am I saying? I'm saying that if you are working the whole day hard at something, you need some, not distraction, but you need some way to communicate with other people so that you actually go and meet other people. And of course, the tables in those peculiar bars in those pharmaceutical companies should be covered with paper so you can draw on them. But today, everyone's going to say you need a tablet. But I'm still in a paper world. I think
maybe a whiteboard.
I think teaching creativity is done through case studies, so that I think actually the greatest device, it's interesting to see if you'll agree that the great advantage of the American graduate education in chemistry system, the real secret of what makes it work, is the research group meeting. In those meetings, people maybe report, and they differ depending on the research group and the background of the people, but someone may report on their work. There may be somebody else brings a paper from the literature. The research director may give some trouble to some people, and some people talk more than others, but somehow it is in those research meetings that you learn what you don't learn in courses. That is, you learn that there are some papers that are published that are lousy papers, and there are some others that are good ones. And you learn what is hype and what is not hype, so that you learn subtle judgment about quality of science. And you also learn how to present things. You get criticized heavily in your presentations. It's an open setting. So I think that kind of structure, a research group meeting, fosters creativity. I think it's very hard for a teacher who is required to teach a certain amount of material for a Regents type course, let us say in New York State, to find the time to get some creativity out of the students. But I think one can do it. One can ask them to write a Primo Levi-like paper on imagining that they are an element, or trying to relate an element to some emotional experience that they've had. Pick your favorite elements. Tell me what you like about it. Relate it to something human. It's possible to do it.
We're down, believe it or not, to the last 5 or so minutes, so we may only have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. Let's go with this one from the audience. Tell us a few inspiring moments that you had as a teacher.
Well, they often, sometimes they come afterwards when you meet up the students. There were 2 students, these were graduate students that I saved for chemistry. One was an undergraduate, Daniel Kahn, who's now at Harvard Medical School. The other was Frank Douglas, and they were people who got caught up in those days, the hippie days, and student protest days and various things, and somehow I was able to communicate them something about the value of doing chemistry. Other kinds of things I wind up going through in Italy somewhere, going through a small town, and this policeman whistles me down, and he says, "Dr. Hoffmann." It turns out I thought I was being arrested. It turned out to be an Italian-American student who had gone back to Italy. But he remembered me. I didn't remember him. I think the moments come when the class surprises me in some way by doing. I don't remember a specific instance, but there were a couple of times when I gave what I thought it was a hard exam and everyone did well. And that was a really, first I thought, oh, that was a badly designed exam. And then I said, Roald, you're crazy. That's just a testimony that you taught pretty well, that particular group of people. It's always been the greatest fun to teach. I've done it only at the college level, but as I said, I've done it in introductory and at the introductory level. The hardest group to teach were the pre-medical students, perhaps the engineering students. They're too professionally minded. The greatest fun to teach were the two extremes of the honors students, where one could teach a calculus-based introductory course, and the absolutely lowest level course, which people were taking as a requirement. They may be majoring in ag economics, but they took it and they came in with no expectations, and they would have been happy with a C, and I could start from a somewhat negative point, and I could get them interested. That was really fun.
Wow. Well, I think that we've got just about to the end of our time this evening. I want to thank you so very much, Dr. Hoffmann, for taking an hour out of your time to share all of your pearls of wisdom with these teachers listening in.
Well, I'm very happy to do that. I want them, of course, to buy my poetry books as much as I want them to buy some of the more chemical books. It's harder to make a living as a poet than as a chemist, I assure you.
Well, while we're on the subject of product placement, if anyone is listening in the Washington, D.C. area, Dr. Hoffmann will be giving a free reading from his play Should've at the National Academy of Sciences on October 27th. And you can register online at CPNAS, that's Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences.org. And again, Dr. Hoffmann, on behalf of the American Association of Chemistry Teachers and the ACS, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful evening.
I'm glad to talk to people. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.